Gladiators VC Avengers. What kind of arena are we even picturing this in? And what are the big things we got to keep in mind when we're comparing these two completely different types of warriors?
I think what makes this so fascinating is that you're talking about two totally different fighting styles
Right.
and totally different eras.
Yeah.
You know, on the one hand, you've got the gladiators. They were trained for spectacle and survival in the Roman Coliseum, and they specialize in all sorts of different combat. You know, some of them, like the mermillo, they were heavily armored. They just relied on brute force. But then you had others, like the retiarius, who were super agile. They would use nets and tridents, and they were all about being cunning. Then on the other hand, you have the Avengers. With their superpowers and technology, they've got a totally different approach. I'm thinking about Iron Man, right?
Yeah.
He's got that high-tech suit. And then there's Thor wielding lightning, and Captain America with his vibranium shield.
So how would these warriors, who are both masters of their own, way of fighting, how would they actually fare against each other? It's wild to think about.
Yeah.
So would the gladiators even have a chance? What advantages would their training and experience give them?
Okay, so gladiators were seriously disciplined, right? They were masters of hand-to-hand combat, and they had to be because they were facing death every single day. That kind of experience gives you more than just skills. It gives you this mental toughness that you can't underestimate.
Yeah, that's a good point. But a lot of their strengths are in close combat, right?
So would those strengths actually become weaknesses against the Avengers?
Absolutely. I mean, as skilled as they are, gladiators don't really have ranged attacks besides projectiles. Can you imagine them trying to reach Iron Man when he's flying?
Oh, yeah.
Or Thor while he's, summoning lightning? It would be a disaster.
Right.
And even though gladiators train for all sorts of opponents, they would never be prepared for superpowers.
Yeah.
Imagine a blast of energy from Iron Man, or
Yeah.
getting caught in Spider-Man's webs.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So the Avengers definitely have some advantages. But what about the Coliseum? Would that pose a challenge for them?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the Coliseum itself is a complex environment, right? It has tight spaces, tunnels, and this roaring crowd. So that could actually limit their movement and make it harder for them to use some of their larger scale attacks.
It's not just the environment though, is it? The Avengers are used to fighting villains.
Right.
Not warriors who are basically being forced to fight for their lives.
Yeah.
Would that affect how they approach the fight?
I think that's a really good point. I mean, the Avengers have a strong moral code. Would they really be willing to use lethal force against gladiators, who are basically victims themselves?
Right.
I think it adds a whole other layer of complexity that could affect their decisions and their fighting style.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's imagine some specific matchups. How do you think a heavily armored mermillo would do against, say, Hulk or Thor?
I mean, a mermillo relies on strength and heavy armor, but against Hulk or Thor, I just don't see it working. Hulk's raw power could just crush the mermillo's defenses. And Thor, with his lightning and his strength, it's hard to imagine the mermillo winning in any scenario.
Okay, so brute strength wouldn't cut it. What about a more agile gladiator like a retinarius against Iron Man?
Ooh, now that's interesting. If a retinarius could get close enough, they might be able to entangle Iron Man with their net, but Iron Man is so fast.
Yeah.
And he can fly. It would be a long shot, and it would rely on the retinarius being super accurate and a lot of luck.
Okay, so maybe not a great strategy there, but
Yeah.
what if the gladiators could, strategize? Are there any tactics they could use to try to outsmart the Avengers?
I mean, they could definitely use the Coliseum to their advantage. They could use the structure for cover, set traps, and maybe even force the Avengers into close quarters where their powers wouldn't be as effective. That could help even the odds a little bit. And they could also observe the Avengers, look for weaknesses or less experienced members, and target those.
So it sounds like the gladiators are at a big disadvantage, but they're not totally hopeless. What do you think would ultimately decide the outcome of this battle?
I think that's the most interesting part of this whole thing. You know, raw power and technology would definitely play a huge role, but it might actually be the intangible factors that tip the scales.
Like what?
Like the gladiators' desperation, the Avengers' potential hesitation, or even the influence of the crowd.
What really stood out to me was how the gladiators' tactics, which they've honed over centuries, could give them an edge, especially against certain Avengers.